Hi, this is Chester Moore, and we're at the 2026 Huntfish Podcast Summit. And we're about to have a panel discussion on the North American model of wildlife conservation. And it is something that is paramount to the success we've seen of wildlife recovery and conservation here in North America. It's used in different ways in different places throughout the world. There's also like a lot of mysteries about this. The word's thrown around a lot. Maybe people don't understand it fully. And sort of get us started off with this, Gray Thornton is going to talk about the 7 sisters of this, the sort of the guidebook of what keeps us intact, whether it's with the North American model or it's against it.
Thank you, Chester. And maybe a good way to start is first say, where did it come from?
Yeah.
And then, to be specific, there's no laws, although laws come from it. But where it came from is actually 2 Canadians. The concept for it was Dr. Valerius Geist, a brilliant man now since passed, great wildlife biologist, somewhat of a wildlife philosopher. But what he did is he looked at North America, and in this case specifically Canada and the USA, not necessarily Mexico. Different principles apply there. It had pillars, I guess. And he came up with these 7 pillars. We can call them pillars or principles. And then he articulated those to a contemporary guy now, a good friend of most of us, Shane Mahoney. And Shane Mahoney in the late 1990s, early 2000s started to promulgate this concept of how we've managed wildlife. To dive into it, there are 7 pillars or sisters. Number 1, that wildlife is held in public trust, or we can dive into that. It's also called the public trust doctrine. A prohibition and elimination of market hunting, and basically it's prohibition of commerce on dead wildlife. That the harvest of wildlife is allocated by law. Democratic rule of law is one of the pillars. A prohibition on non-frivolous use, wanton waste, so we can dive into that. And a principle or pillar or sister that wildlife is an international resource, not governed by boundaries of states, provinces, or even countries. And then one thing that is so critical, I think, to us, certainly on this panel, is that wildlife is best managed by the best available science. And then lastly, opportunity for all. All citizens have the opportunity and the freedom to utilize that wildlife.
Well, I think for the limited time we have here, let's kind of dive into the wildlife recovery aspect. I mean, I think people point back and say, thanks to the North American model, we brought this species from this number to this number. And any of you can answer this. What do you think is like the primary species, or maybe a couple that have been like the shining examples of this?
Turn of the century, and now let's go back, since we're now in the 2020s, but the turn of the century, 1900s. It's about 400,000 or 500,000 white-tailed deer in the United States. I don't know what the harvest. We're here in Texas. I think the harvest in Texas now is probably 1 million a year. There's more than 5, 6, 7 million white-tailed deer. But if you look at almost every single species of big game that we have in North America, from black bear to pronghorn antelope to whitetail to mule deer to elk, they for the most part, hit their lows in the late 1890s, 1900s. And these principles of conservation, first and foremost, and then best articulated in the North American wildlife conservation model, which again was kind of conceptualized far later, brought those numbers back. Laws, all sorts of policies that were put in place by visionary conservationists that created an unendangered species instead of an endangered species.
Actually, Shane Mahoney at the Sheep Show said something to the effect of most of the game animals we hunt, if they still existed, if we hadn't done this, would have been on the endangered species list.
Without question.
Yeah. So to get there, whether it's wild sheep, whether it's whitetail, whether it's elk, mule deer, which you have experience hunting, Herman, what role has science played in that? What role has science played in monitoring, establishing bag limit seasons, or creating ways to conserve this?
All right. Well, what you have to look at is you're talking about, for one, it starts with the 1937 Wildlife Reclamation Act, which funds the ability for each state to do the science, to do the research that they need to do to be able to set game laws and restrictions or regulations. And, and that's the deal. You have all your Western, and primarily my experience is in the Western states, where they're divided into districts or areas, and each place is, got populations, and from that they discern how to best manage those populations. And this is a science that, is what is good wildlife management. It's a form of, I always likened it to animal husbandry. If you understand a little bit about animal husbandry, you'll understand something about the science that goes into the type of wildlife management that we've talked about up to this point. So that starts with the 1937 Wildlife Reclamation Act. And if you want to go before that, you're talking about Teddy Roosevelt. And if we're trying to introduce this concept to people who have not heard of the North American model, well, then we'll start off saying everybody knows Teddy Roosevelt. Everybody knows he was instrumental in parks and in public lands. And this is where all this comes from.
Absolutely. Gray, with the Wild Sheep Foundation, a lot of the money in the grant and aid goes into funding research. And research ends up sometimes making policy changes or, steering rate. Can you give an example of how sort of modern science or the technology side has steered something you've seen in a wild sheep conservation example?
Yeah, and Chester, you go back to, one of the pillars of the model that wildlife is managed by the best available science. Science is a moving target. We constantly are trying to learn more and more and more. And really what that dives in from a model standpoint is that wildlife should be managed by wildlife professionals, governed by policies and a democratic process that provides agencies, that empowers agencies to then hire their professionals and then guide us on science. If you look at wild sheep, but we're constantly learning the challenges with disease. But we're also learning science on nutrition. How does, like a human, the more healthy, the more nutritionally balanced the human is, the more resistant that human is to disease. Same thing with the wild sheep. So it all goes back to best available science. And, to Herman's point, on that funding, wild sheep benefit from, the Pittman-Robertson Act, where, we can raise money, we can drive it into an agency from a variety of ways, but we can direct that money into the agency. There's a 3-to-1 match on the monies that we provide an agency that they can then use to manage wild sheep or other wildlife. So, everything is interwoven. And that was one of those things that Valerius Geist found, that, wow, this is, there's these pillars, but they're all interwoven and they all play a role in how we've brought wildlife back from, an endangered species to a fully recovered species.
So when Geist put all this together and, started looking at what had happened and where it was headed, I think that was one of the genius parts is it's almost like an ecosystem. It's just this thing is kind of living and breathing, and you have things that all work together, but it's all fueled by people, one way or the other. And Renée, with Women Hunt, I've noticed just in the times I've been at the FTW with you that quite a bit of those women that came for that are young wildlife professionals. So in your experience, how many of those have been exposed to this concept of the North American model of wildlife conservation, and how important is it for you that they understand this moving forward?
Yeah, great question. So what we've noticed through the program Women Hunt of the Wild Sheep Foundation is that every year we have women who apply and are selected to come through our field to fork training who are wildlife professionals. And what we're hearing anecdotally from them is that through their educational stream, they are at a minimum briefly introduced to the model in their formal education, and at a maximum rather, and at a minimum, perhaps not even being taught anything really concrete about the value of hunting and the role of their future careers as wildlife professionals and learning how to balance future policy or decision making to incorporate the hunter and the role of hunting in the model in conservation. So, what we're really encouraged by is understanding that through our touch points with wildlife professionals, through a small way, we're able to help shift some dialogue there. And, that's one of the reasons why our program has always prioritized conservation education. While we concentrate on skills training to develop women and empower them to be strong, ethically based hunters, we also always educate them on conservation themes, including the North American model and its sisters or its pillars. And all I can say is that they come away transformed, not just by their personal development, but also by better understanding the model, and that their jobs as wildlife professionals are critically important in ensuring that public access for all remains throughout their careers.
The reason I asked that question in particular is because those wildlife professionals, biologists, and field technicians are going to be the one giving data to policymakers in their departments or maybe at the federal level. So this could be, anyone could answer this. How have you seen agencies balance the science part with public pressure, whether that be for hunting versus non-hunting or anti-hunting, or which species gets the bigger share of the pie?
The agencies, okay, we're in Texas, so we're going to talk about Texas Parks and Wildlife. Texas Parks and Wildlife is one of the best state agencies to work with. I've guided in several western states, and I feel, to me, Texas Parks and Wildlife is great to work with. They have great public outreach. They're easy to work with. Texas, 95% private property, may have something to do with it, but they work with people. They work with people very well. How do they decide which species to, take care of the most or put the most money towards? I think they do an excellent job, and along with the NGOs that come on. I mean, the bighorn sheep out in West Texas, they do a great job. They all work together. They have, I think they have a great working relationship. The whitetails in Texas is almost a no-brainer. Everybody takes care of them. And when you grow up in Texas, that you're very closely connected to the outdoors. And that's something that needs to be worked on. I mean, there's absolutely sections of this country that's not the case. With this model that we're talking about, this concept, there's a black and white. This is how it works. This is how it's been working. This is why we enjoy the populations we enjoy today. That needs to be taught in school. That's American history, K through 12. That should be in school. This is black and white. This is as simple as the birds and the bees. There shouldn't be any question about it, So we just need to get the word out there a little more, and I think it's the outdoor writing community's job to do it, because those are the guys that are doing it, and those are the guys that are closest to it, and they're going to do a whole lot better job than legacy media would be.
So let's just maybe drill that down a little deeper here. So you mentioned whitetails in Texas, I would say almost elk in many places. Kind of some of that's just controlling populations in certain areas. Mm-hmm. But with bighorn sheep, maybe bison in certain areas, mountain goats, there probably aren't enough tags over the counter to pay for those programs. So this is where things like NGOs, like the Wild Sheep Foundation, its chapters and affiliates, other organizations come in. Gray, you want to talk about that?
You bet. And, if you look at bighorn sheep, we talked about wildlife populations coming back from the 1900s, their lows. Bighorn sheep didn't hit their lows until the late 1960s, 1970s. So it was kind of a slight oddity. And went down from 1800s at 1 million or so in North America to 25,000. Precipitous drop. Bottom line, there were so few, they didn't pay their way to the agency. So unlike elk, unlike mule deer, unlike pronghorn, we're not enough tags to generate the revenue. So it's organizations like Wild Sheep Foundation. The first wild sheep advocacy organization was an organization called Fraternity of the Desert Bighorn out of southern Nevada, Las Vegas, 56 years old. And so, it was hunters, conservationists that joined together that said, we will raise the money, we'll drive that into the agency and make those species a priority. And in so doing, we then expanded those species. Trap and translocations. There's been 2,200 translocations since the 1940s. About 24,000 bighorn sheep have been translocated from Canada to the U.S., around the U.S., within provinces, within states. And it's brought bighorn sheep back from 25,000 to about 85,000. Now we're far, far from 1 million, but, a 3-time recovery. But if I can make a point to Herman's point on how well we work with Texas Parks and Wildlife, there are other states that we don't work well with. And if you start looking into that question, if you start looking in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, a little north of us here, there's a lot of Texans in Lake City, Colorado. Let me tell you what, Colorado is a perfect example of a state and not so much the agency, but the commission within that state that is not listening to their agency. There's constantly ballot measures. We talk about one of the principles being managed wildlife and best available science. Sadly, in many states, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, it's being managed by the ballot box. So public emotion versus science. So completely abhorrent to the principle. And I was just reading an article recently where even though the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department, their state agency, urged the commission not to vote for a ban on fur, the commission just voted 6-4 to ban fur, completely against the advice of the wildlife professionals. So there's a classic example, and there's a bunch more.
Yeah, that initiative and referendum thing, that's kind of a saving grace in Texas. We don't have it, right? No, we don't have that, so we don't get outline bans on the ballot necessarily like we would in a state like Colorado if you get enough signatures. And so that is a difference of, once again, going against really no scientific basis, but going on like an emotional thing. That just sets that push and pull with the public and other interests like that. But the cornerstone of, if you can have the research, you can have the habitat, but if you don't have the funding, we've already talked about that Pittman-Robertson thing, and I want to get down deeper into this funding thing and talk about conservation permits from it. I mean, the conservation permits, not just for like wild sheep, but there's mule deer and all kinds of wildlife. Wild Sheep Foundation itself offers permits for other agencies for all kinds of wildlife. I've seen pronghorn permits up there and elk and things like that. So do you know offhand a percentage of how much these kind of permits, or maybe even for raffles and things, are added to what comes through Pittman-Robertson?
You bet. I can't tell you the dollars of all of them. I could certainly tell you the dollars that Wild Sheep generates, and then the percentage of the state agency that funds wild sheep conservation. We're talking about, lay person terms, governor tag or whatever. And why they came up with the term governor tag is 1980, Governor Ed Herschler in Wyoming offered a Wyoming bighorn sheep permit to the Foundation for North America Wild Sheep, which Wild Sheep Foundation used to be, to sell. And the caveat was that 100% of the dollars raised would be spent in the state. Now, we call them now conservation permits. It's a very unique form of funding. It takes a additive number to the pool for the public, an additive number, and makes them available typically on auction and or raffle, or both. Wild Sheep Foundation is probably the marquee seller of these permits. There are others that do a great job as well. But we'll drive $6, $7, $8 million into state, provincial, and tribal agencies from just the sale of 32 to 35 permits a year. So now you have, $6 to $8 to $9 million driven into the agency. Those dollars are available for a 3-to-1 match. We sold a permit for a bighorn sheep in New Mexico in 2025 for $1.3 million just for the opportunity to harvest a bighorn sheep. With a 3-to-1 match, that one opportunity was worth over $4 million to the state agency. What's also critical is 2014, I asked our biologist staff to do a study on, how relevant is that money? What impact does it make to these agencies? In 2014, 73% of all wild sheep conservation agency dollars came from either a raffle or an auction tag. 10 years later, in the U.S. alone, is now 83%. So, that one small little piece of funding model, which is consistent with the North American model, because states had and provinces and tribes have the ability to determine how they'll raise money to manage wildlife. That's a huge component of what we call the wild sheep economy. And, there are those that don't like that concept. And they'll use the opportunity for all. And I understand that, but they're additive. The states have authorized it, and it's the best form of funding. If we lose it, how do we replace it? Yeah, that's the key. You're going to raise the cost of a bighorn sheep license, which are very limited, to cover $1.3 million? Don't think you can.
Yeah. And I think that really leads into the next question here, because you have to have people understanding this at the legislative level, within the departments, within the hunting community, maybe within the broader wildlife community. And Renée, since I first heard the term adult onset hunter from you. I was like, what's that? It sounds like a cool sickness I need to get, something. I like that. But it's, you're someone who in adulthood decided you're going to get involved in this hunting thing. And I remember you talking about how learning about the conservation impacts were kind of a cornerstone for you.
Yeah.
So when you're working with maybe some of these ladies through Women Hunt, we mentioned that maybe a few of the wildlife professionals have heard of it, but what do they think? What are you hearing that people are thinking about that my raffle ticket or what I bid on, or even just down to the basic hunting license or excise tax? How are people feeling in this newer generation of hunters that they actually get some skin in the game on keeping sheep on the mountain or pheasant out in the prairie or whatever it is?
I think what I'm observing and learning from this program is their journeys are very similar to mine in a sense. This particular part of Women Hunt that we're talking about is for people over the age of 21. So they're all adults, and the majority of them weren't raised in a hunting background, or maybe just peripherally they knew somebody who hunted. So it's very much an awakening for them, like it was for me on my journey. And what I'm finding is, like most topics related to hunting and conservation, whether it's the model or outside of the model, hot topics like trophy hunting or other items like that, it really is coming down to just the dialogue, the education, and the understanding. And so when we have sessions with these women, before we even send them on skills training, we have multiple learning sessions with them where we talk about the North American model, concepts like trophy hunting, what does it mean to hunt charismatic megafauna in Africa, etc. The model is very much embraced by them. It's a revelation, and I think it really demonstrates, and it's really tough to do. All these topics are complex. They're not really 30-second sound bites, which, as we know in today's day and age, is pretty much what's palatable out there for youth. But if you have an opportunity to have a longer dialogue with these people who are just starting out and learning, and so, or that percentage of the population who has no understanding at all, if you're able to get the time to convey it more fulsomely, I'm seeing that the preconceived notions or the biases are falling away with a calm, reasoned explanation. And that includes the concept of these special permits and the money they raise, which can be very controversial for some and very emotive. And as soon as there's an opportunity to explain that it is additive, it does not reduce access, what it benefits with the match, at least in the United States, those misconceptions start to fall away.
Yeah. It's good to hear because, these are decision makers. Maybe at some level, just in a few years, they're going to be passing that information on. Or certainly if they're 21, they could vote. And they might be in a state like Colorado or somewhere where there's one of these ballot initiatives on there. And science has a hard time, it seems, translating to the ballot box. That seems like it's a hard area to reach. And that brings me up to the next question, which is, we know that a majority of wildlife conservation in America has been paid by hunters and anglers, but there are other ways conservation is funded. Other NGOs, but not everybody who buys ammunition is hunting. There's all those little parts of that. Do you think that other user groups, let's use bird watchers, for example, should contribute more to wildlife conservation?
You would wish that would be just automatic. I'm not going to try to change something that works. I'm not going to advocate to change anything right now that's working. We've seen companies that turn down the opportunities with the Dingell-Johnson Act, who turned down the opportunities to contribute to wildlife conservation, and so you're not going to get those folks right away. The only way this is to make something better is to bring, like we said, more young people in, make this like I said earlier, American history K through 12 lesson. This is something that obviously works anytime when you have a ballot box initiative and referendums, ballot box biology, that is generally something that is, those people think they're saving something when what they're doing is actually working to the detriment of that wildlife. Now, we can look at it and very reasonably and logically explain to them why that's not going to work. And if they're honest and reasonable, they'll listen to that and they'll understand it. If they're not, then you're not going to reach those folks. So,
well, Herman jumped right in right as I was about to finish the question. He nailed what I was going to say. But what I was going to say is there has been concern that if other user groups get involved, that they will want to claim more of a role in the management. Is that a legitimate concern?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'll say probably.
Yeah.
And I only say that because I know, like, just in my 10 years in this realm, I've realized how terms that have been used very reasonably in the hunting community for decades have been co-opted by those who oppose hunting. Terms like trophy hunting have fallen so far away from their origins that they've been mutilated or mutated by the antis, as well as the term conservation used to really singularly be used within the hunting community as opposed to preservation, and that's been co-opted as well. So I mean, I think there's real risk, but I am saying that in a non-scientifically based way. Yeah.
Well, there's to both your points, you made great ones. There's been all sorts of attempts, all sorts of legislation to try to bring in the non-consumptive user into this fold.
Yeah.
CARA, there's current, there's funding coming from offshore oil drilling. There's all sorts of ideas to bring more money, from the non-consumptive user into this model. This model is also based primarily on huntable species.
Yeah.
But it does benefit non-huntable species. But, how do we deal with that? Some of the challenges right now, and certainly a fear, if you look at, just the United States, we have a population of 360 million people. How many millions hunt? 14 million. How many fish? About another 24 or so. So us, we're a minority, but we're paying for the system. What happens when the majority pays for the system and then says hunting is no longer relevant? Now, to Herman's point, there has been attempts, and they most typically decline. Would you buy a permit to go birdie? Well, no, it's just my right. Would you like to buy a permit to go hiking? Oh, no, it's my right. Where early on, and Herman touched on this, very early on, we defined from a hunting and angling standpoint a user pay system. We will buy hunting licenses. We'll buy fishing licenses. We'll pay for tags. We'll pay for, species tags. And that's what's funded this model. So it's a real challenge right now. It is probably a reasonable fear. But, again, we're the minority. We need to be the ones being the leaders here too. And saying, look, it's, to Herman's point, it does work. Don't break it. Are there tweaks to it that we can do? Sure. And that's what's being discussed now. But again, it needs to be discussed not in an emotional fashion, but a realistic, non-emotional, based on science, based on facts. And that's where the challenge is, because a good number of public aren't basing anything on science or anything on facts, just pure emotion.
Just one more question, and for everyone here, what can we do to make sure this model of conservation still soldiers on, doing what it does, and that there are people who are committed to being like champions of it? What can we do as an industry and maybe even as individuals?
It's going to keep going. We recognize it now. There's more. In my view, I'm hearing more about it now than I've ever heard about it. And that's what it requires. It needs to be repeated until it becomes something that ever is a household, something you hear all the time. North American Wildlife Conservation Model, that's a big old thing to say. But if it's a North American model for wildlife, everybody can relate to that. And get the terminologies right. Know that trophy hunting is buzzword. What is it? It's animal husbandry. That's all it is.
Right.
And it's something you do. It's not a bad thing. And we just got to keep after it. And there's more hunters now. We're getting more hunters in. We'll continue to do that. And if we keep making this material available and saying, guys, this is all you got to do is put it out there and go, guys, this is how come we have what we have. This is a good thing. Sooner or later, we'll catch up.
To Herman's point, I think there's some key things that we can all concentrate on as individuals and all organizations, whether we're in the nonprofit realm, the private industry, the NGOs and government. But, we're talking about engaging, to Herman's point, talking about it, making people aware of it. A challenge, I think, in this day and age, as I made reference to a moment ago, about 30-second sound bites. But, there are ways. I've been seeing more and more very impactful and provocative billboards that are using very simple language to explain why, for example, it's okay to hunt a bear and that bear meat is good to eat. I mean, I'm using too many words. The billboard was super simple and it got the point across, right? But there are ways. So I think engagement, that continuing to awareness and education, supporting organizations that are doing the good work is super important. And there's lots of really great grassroots stuff out there for especially for the younger people who are online and want those quicker sound bites. There's not just organizations like the Wild Sheep Foundation and many others at the national, state, local levels, but there's, ones that are focused on those ballot box initiatives that can really get the grassroots movement going. And that particularly youth, as we all know, really like to advocate and get out and demonstrate and vocalize. So, connect with those ones. I can think of a few off the top of my head. Howl.org, CRWM in Colorado has just been doing great things in that state alone to try to tackle things, but there's many. So I would say those are the key ones: engage, educate, advocate, get that message out.
And finally, be a good ambassador. Follow the laws. Be articulate in your argument. Be respectful in your arguments. Just be a good ambassador. And if you're going to share pictures of your hunt, share them tastefully. Share them within a realm that can accept them in the in the way they're portrayed. But I think if you want to be an influencer in a very positive way, and just be a good ambassador for hunting, for angling, and for conservation, and be demonstrative of what you believe.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was a great representative of sort of the challenges that we face, the triumphs we've come through, and sort of a charge to keep to move forward.